had only been stationed on Zyphera 7 for a few weeks when everything went to hell. The mission was simple: diplomatic outreach. Humans were the newcomers to galactic politics, and I was one of our first liaisons. We were still figuring out all the strange customs, laws, and traditions of the various species, and I had been briefed on the most critical ones. But there was no way to memorize every obscure cultural rule across a dozen alien civilizations, and that, as it turned out, was going to be a big problem. It started with something completely ordinary. I needed to find a restroom. I had been sitting through an excruciatingly long political discussion, nodding at the right times while Cypherian officials debated things I barely understood. Their language was tricky, full of layered meanings and formal structures that required a translator to untangle. I had been drinking too much of the herbal tea they kept offering, more out of politeness than anything else, and now I was about to burst. I excused myself as subtly as I could, trying not to draw attention. The halls of the Zypherian palace were vast and winding, with deep purple walls lined with glowing runes. Everything had a smooth, organic feel, as if the structure had grown rather than been built. I followed the path I thought led to the nearest restroom, but the architecture of the palace was confusing. One hallway curved into another, and soon I had no idea where I was. Frustrated, I opened the nearest door, hoping I'd find what I was looking for. Instead, I found something much worse. The room was dimly lit, illuminated by soft, floating orbs of golden light. At its center, standing in front of a long, ornate mirror, was a Shafirian woman. She had deep violet skin, bioluminescent markings shimmering along her arms and back, and intricate silver tattoos that ran in elegant patterns across her body. She was also, unmistakably, completely unclothed. I froze, she froze. For a long second, neither of us moved. My brain struggled to catch up, trying to process what I was seeing and why it was such a big deal. Then I noticed the way her golden eyes widened in absolute horror. A split second later, she let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her bioluminescent markings flared bright crimson, a color I had learned meant shame, disgrace, or deep offense. I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain, to say something that would make this better, but before I could, the alarms blared. A deafening, high-pitched chime echoed through the palace, sending a surge of panic through my body. Within moments, the door behind me burst open and half a dozen Shiferian guards stormed inside, their ceremonial spears crackling with energy. I raised my hands instinctively, but the woman was already pointing a shaking finger at me, her voice a mix of outrage and desperation. "You have seen me unclothed, human," she cried. The guards stepped forward, their weapons humming. "Now you must marry me, or they'll kill us both." I stood in the center of a grand chamber, my wrists bound by glowing energy restraints that hummed with a low, constant vibration. The Zypherian Council of Elders sat before me in a semicircle, their deep violet robes pooling around them like dark shadows. Their expressions were unreadable, but I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. Vela, the woman I had accidentally walked in on, stood beside me, arms crossed, her skin still tinged with crimson, a sign that her embarrassment had not faded. The head elder, an imposing figure with glowing silver tattoos that marked him as the highest authority in the room, leaned forward. His golden eyes bored into me with the intensity of someone weighing a death sentence. "Do you understand the severity of what you have done?" I cleared my throat, choosing my words carefully. With all due respect, I didn't do anything. This was an accident, a misunderstanding. A murmur passed through the chamber, a mix of disgust and disbelief. Another elder, her bioluminescence pulsing faintly, spoke. "Ignorance does not absolve you of guilt. You have seen an unmarried Cypherian in a state of undress. Such a thing is forbidden in our culture." Vela let out a sharp breath. "And not just forbidden," she snapped. It is an irreversible disgrace, one that can only be rectified in two ways. She turned to face me, eyes blazing with resentment. Marriage or death. I stiffened. That seems a little extreme. The head elder's expression didn't change. Our laws have been upheld for centuries. There is no room for negotiation. I glanced around the room, trying to find some sort of escape route, but the guards were already poised for action. Their ceremonial spears crackled with energy, ready to strike at a moment's notice. I looked back at Vela, who was practically vibrating with frustration. Okay, but let's say hypothetically we don't want to get married. The elder's eyes narrowed. Then you shall be executed, both of you. Vela made a frustrated noise in the back of her throat, as if she couldn't believe she was in this situation either. I cannot believe this is happening. Yeah, well, neither can I muttered under my breath. The head elder raised a hand, signaling to the guards. The choice must be made now. Panic flickered through me. This couldn't be real. This was some kind of bureaucratic nightmare, some cultural misunderstanding that I'd wake up from. But the lethal energy in those spears looked very real. Vela clenched her jaw, glaring at me like I was the bane of her existence. Then she exhaled sharply, her expression shifting from rage to bitter resignation. Fine, she bit out. I'll marry him. The room fell into heavy silence. The elder nodded once. Then it shall be so. The wedding preparations were a blur of exotic customs and oppressive formality. The Gyfarian palace, which I had once thought of as a place of grandeur and alien beauty, now felt like a labyrinth of endless corridors, each one leading to more surreal and uncomfortable experiences. The ceremony was only a few hours away, but before I could even think about what was happening, I was caught in a whirlwind of alien rituals. Vela had made it clear from the moment we were married that this was not a union she had any interest in. I could see it in the sharpness of her gaze, in the way her skin still flushed with embarrassment. She was a warrior, a leader among her people, and being married to a human diplomat, however unintentionally, was a grave dishonor to her. Still, here I was, dressed in some ridiculous ceremonial garb that felt more like a straitjacket than a robe. The fabric was a metallic blue, shimmering and woven with patterns that seemed to shift and pulse as I moved. It had been hastily pulled over my head by attendants who didn't speak a word of my language. They didn't need to. It was clear that this wasn't about comfort or style, it was about tradition. Vela, on the other hand, had been given an entirely different treatment. Her ceremonial attire was a blend of intricate fabrics and armor that looked more like something out of a history book than the garb of a bride. Her bioluminescent markings, which had been flaring with indignation since the moment we were dragged into this farce, had softened, but they still glowed faintly, signaling that she wasn't happy with how this was all playing out. She was pacing back and forth in front of a large mirror in our shared quarters, adjusting her attire with a practiced hand, clearly irritated. I can't believe this is happening, she muttered under her breath, but it wasn't directed at me. The words were more for herself, a personal rant that had been building since the moment the council had sealed our fate. I stood awkwardly by the window, staring out at the sprawling view of the Zyferian city below. The planet was beautiful, almost haunting in its stillness, but my mind was 1,000 miles away from the view outside. I never asked for this, I said finally, breaking the silence. Vela didn't respond at first. She simply reached for a long, ceremonial blade that hung on the wall, inspecting its edge with a focused intensity. Neither did I, she replied after a moment, her voice low. I let out a sigh. Look, I know this isn't exactly the dream wedding, but we have to get through this. The sooner we're done with it, the sooner we can go our separate ways. She turned to face me, her eyes narrowing. You may want to go your separate way, human, but this is my life, my honor. You have ruined everything. I opened my mouth to argue, but I stopped myself. What could I say? She was right. In an instant, I had gone from an unknown diplomat to a walking scandal. The room was silent again, except for the sound of our breathing and the distant hum of palace life beyond the walls. We were both trapped in this marriage, two strangers bound by a mistake neither of us had intended. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her shoulders slumping slightly. "This will be over soon enough," she muttered. "We'll perform the ceremony, pretend everything is fine, and then we'll both go back to our lives." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I had no idea what my life would look like after this, but I sure as hell wasn't looking forward to it. The door to the room opened then, and a pair of attendants entered, offering no words, only gestures that told us to follow. It was time. As we walked out into the grand hall, the weight of the situation hit me all over again. The room was filled with Cypherians, officials, nobles, family, all of them dressed in their finest attire. The air was thick with formality, and every eye in the room seemed to be fixed on us. The floor beneath my feet felt cold, unwelcoming, and the pressure on my chest grew with each step. Vela didn't glance at me once as we approached the ceremonial platform, her focus entirely on what was ahead. I wanted to say something, anything to make this easier, but the words wouldn't come. So I followed her lead, silently resigning myself to the fact that this would be my life now, married to a woman who wanted nothing to do with me, in a place where I didn't belong, surrounded by people who couldn't care less about my existence. The doors closed behind us, and the ceremony began. The ceremony felt like a dream, a surreal, disorienting blur that I was helpless to escape. I stood beside Vela, trying to keep my composure as the high priest began the ritual. His voice echoed through the grand chamber, speaking in a language I barely understood, even with the translator device tucked behind my ear. Every word seemed laden with ancient weight, and the air was thick with the gravity of what was happening. Vela remained stiff beside me, her posture rigid, her face a mask of cold resignation. The elaborate patterns on her skin, which had once been vivid and full of life, now seemed dull and muted in the dim lighting of the ceremonial hall. I had never seen her look so detached, so utterly unreachable. This was not the woman I had seen in the council chamber or in the palace halls. It was as if she had been swallowed by the expectations of this moment. I couldn't help but feel the pressure of the entire room pressing down on me. Every Cypherian in attendance seemed to be watching us, their eyes fixed on the proceedings with intense focus. I was acutely aware of every movement I made, every breath I took, as if the slightest misstep might bring down the wrath of the entire species. The high priest, an ancient figure with wrinkled skin and eyes that shimmered like stars, continued his chanting, a rhythmic pattern that reverberated in the stone walls of the chamber. The air around us seemed to hum, vibrating with energy as the priest invoked the ancient gods of Zifra. I had no idea what he was saying, but the solemnity of it all was undeniable. Then came the part I had been dreading, the ritual kiss. I felt Vela stiffen beside me, her skin flushing again with an unmistakable red hue, the color of discomfort and anger. She took a shallow breath, but she didn't look at me. It wasn't a question of consent. No, in this culture, consent was irrelevant. This was about honor, and the law had already been decided. I turned toward her, my pulse racing. She didn't move, her face blank, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, as if the entire situation was beneath her. A part of me wanted to apologize again, to try and make some kind of connection, but I knew it was pointless. This wasn't the time or the place for words of comfort. The priest motioned for us to step forward. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step closer, placing my hands in front of me awkwardly, unsure of what was expected. I felt the eyes of every onlooker burning into me, waiting for this ritual to be completed, for the marriage to be sealed in the most intimate and sacred of ways. Vela's lips barely touched mine. There was no passion in it, No warmth, no affection. It was as if she was performing a duty, a task she could not avoid. Her lips were cold, unyielding, and the brief contact made my stomach turn. I wanted to pull back, to run out of the room and leave this nightmare behind, but the weight of the ceremony held me in place. The crowd erupted into applause as soon as the kiss ended, their cheers almost deafening in their intensity. I wanted to block out the sound, to shut it all out, but there was no escaping it. Vela pulled away immediately, her body language as distant as ever. She didn't even look at me, her eyes now focused on the priest who was finishing his chant. I couldn't help but feel the sting of humiliation. There I was, an unwilling participant in this strange and ancient ritual, and Vela, proud, fierce, and strong, had just sealed our fates with a simple, perfunctory touch. It was over. The high priest raised his hands, signaling the end of the ceremony. "It is done," he intoned, his voice full of finality. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the wedding that was over. It was my life as I knew it. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Vela turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't glance back at me once. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her retreat into the distance, wondering if I would ever truly be part of her world. But the answer was clear. I was a stranger here, a mistake of fate, and now I was her husband, whether either of us wanted it or not. The days following the ceremony blurred together in a haze of awkward encounters, strange silences, and a sense of overwhelming alienation. The palace, which had once seemed so vast and full of wonder, now felt oppressive. Every hallway I walked through, every corner I turned, only served to remind me of my status here. An outsider, bound by a contract neither Vela nor I had ever agreed to. Vela's presence was a constant reminder of my situation. She moved through the palace with the same grace and command as before, but there was no warmth in her gaze, no recognition of our shared plight. Her cool indifference made it clear that the marriage, while legally binding, held no meaning for her beyond its necessity. It was a social contract, nothing more. And yet, it was my life now. I had tried to initiate conversation with her, tried to break through the barrier of formality and distance that had sprung up between us. But every time I opened my mouth, she either ignored me or gave me a curt, one-word reply. Her focus was always on her duties as a leader, as a warrior. The weight of her responsibilities seemed to swallow her whole, leaving little room for anything or anyone else. One evening, after another long day of diplomatic meetings, I found myself wandering the palace grounds in a rare moment of solitude. The air was cool, a welcome contrast to the stifling tension I had been living in. The gardens surrounding the palace were lush and otherworldly, with plants that shimmered in the twilight like living stars. I couldn't help but admire the beauty, even in my current state of misery. It was a fleeting distraction, but for a moment, it allowed me to forget the mess I had found myself in. As I strolled deeper into the gardens, I spotted Vela. She was standing by a small, tranquil pool, staring down at the water. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of frustration and something else. Something darker that I couldn't quite place. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if she, too, was struggling with the absurdity of our situation. But when I approached, she stiffened and turned away, her back rigid. "Vela," I said softly, testing the waters, unsure if she would even acknowledge me. She didn't look at me. "You should return to your chambers, human. This place is not for you." I swallowed the sting of her words, but I pressed on. "I don't understand. I never asked for this, and neither did you, but now we're both trapped in it. Don't you think we should at least try to make the best of it?" Her voice was tight when she spoke again, but it was laced with an anger that I hadn't expected. "Make the best of it?" she repeated. "What do you think this is? A game? You think I wanted this to happen? That I wanted to be bound to a human, to live in disgrace because of an accident? I was taken aback by her words. I hadn't realized how deeply the situation had affected her, how much it had shattered her pride. Her bioluminescence was flickering, a pattern of red, a signal of deep frustration, and I saw the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were drawn tight with suppressed emotion. I stepped forward, careful not to crowd her, but wanting to make her see that I wasn't the enemy. I didn't want this either, but I'm not your enemy, Vela. I'm not the one who decided your fate. I'm just as trapped in this as you are. For a long moment, there was silence between us, and I wondered if I had finally said the wrong thing, but then she turned to face me, her eyes narrow and unreadable. I never asked for a human to complicate my life, she said quietly, the venom gone from her tone, replaced by something more raw, more honest. But here we are, and we both have to live with it. We both have to find a way to exist in this absurd reality. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The silence between us deepened, and for the first time since the ceremony, I felt the smallest flicker of connection. It wasn't affection or even understanding, but it was the recognition of our shared predicament. We were both victims of this strange twist of fate, both struggling to navigate a world where we didn't belong. Vela didn't say anything else. She turned back to the pool, her expression distant once again. But something had shifted, if only slightly. There was a crack in her armor, a hint of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. The days continued to stretch on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Despite our brief moment of honesty in the gardens, things between Vela and me remained strained, distant. She kept to her duties, as expected, and I tried to stay out of her way. There was no understanding between us, no connection beyond the forced bond of marriage. But as the days passed, something began to shift in the atmosphere. Subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniably there. It was during a late evening that I first noticed it. I was returning to my quarters after another long day of political meetings, my head swirling with protocol and diplomatic jargon that I had barely managed to retain. The palace was quiet, save for the distant hum of activity, but as I passed by the grand hall, I saw her. Vela was standing near the edge of the balcony, her figure silhouetted against the backdrop of the stars. The soft light of the twin moons bathed her in a pale glow, and for a moment she looked almost human. The rigid walls she had built around herself, the coldness she had worn like armor, seemed to fade as she stared out at the horizon. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but then, without thinking, I walked over to her. I wasn't sure what had changed, but something in me felt compelled to reach out. "Vela," I said softly, my voice breaking the silence. She didn't turn to look at me, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the slightest stiffening of her body. It was like she was bracing herself for something, but she didn't speak. "I've been thinking," I continued, unsure if I should even be speaking, "about what you said, about how this situation, it's not what either of us wanted. I don't know if that makes it any better, but I wanted you to know that I don't blame you." For a long while there was no response, and I thought I might have said the wrong thing again. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Vela spoke. "It doesn't matter, human," she said, her tone almost tired. "None of this matters. We are bound by the rules of my people now, and that is something I cannot change. I don't know how to live with this. With you." I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know how to live with it either. But we don't have to do this alone. We don't have to pretend we don't care." There was another long silence, and then she finally turned to face me. Her expression was harder to read in the dim light, but I could see the flicker of something behind her eyes. "You think it's that simple?" she asked, her voice low and edged with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't quite resignation either. "You think that because you say that, everything will suddenly be different?" I shook my head, feeling the weight of her words. "No, I don't think it's simple, but I think it's worth trying. I think I'm starting to understand what it's like to be you." She studied me for a moment, her bioluminescent markings flickering softly, almost as if she was considering something. Then, without warning, she took a step closer, her gaze intense. "Don't pretend you understand me, human. You don't." Her voice wasn't as harsh as it could have been. It was softer, like she was willing to entertain the possibility, just for a moment, that I might not be entirely alien to her. "I don't understand everything," I admitted, my voice steady. "But I'm trying, and that's more than I've been doing before." Bela let out a slow breath, her posture softening slightly. For the first time since we'd met, I could see a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. An acknowledgement that she was tired too, that she was just as trapped by the circumstances as I was. "I don't know what this is between us," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I don't know if there's any point to it. We're stuck with each other for now," I said, "but that doesn't mean we have to hate it." She didn't respond right away, but after a long pregnant pause, she took a step back, looking out at the stars again. "I suppose," she murmured, almost under her breath, "it doesn't mean we have to hate each other either." I wanted to say something else, to reach out and break down the last of the walls between us, but the moment passed too quickly. She was back to her rigid, controlled self again, the walls closing in once more. But something had shifted, even if it was imperceptible, and in that fleeting moment, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of our story. The days after that moment in the garden were strange, like stepping into a new phase of something that had been stuck in limbo. Vela and I didn't exactly become friends, but the air between us had changed, ever so slightly. It was a delicate truce, an understanding, as fragile as the first rays of dawn. We still moved around the palace in our respective worlds, bound by the same chains of circumstance. But there was less hostility now, less of that cold, impenetrable distance that had defined our interactions since the beginning. I tried to spend my time in more meaningful ways, throwing myself into whatever diplomatic duties I could handle, anything to take my mind off the chaos of my personal life. But no matter how many meetings I sat through or how many treaties I helped craft, nothing felt real, nothing felt important. My every move was still dictated by the fact that I was married to a Cypherian woman I barely knew, someone who had been thrust into this marriage by forces neither of us could control. It gnawed at me, that feeling of being a pawn in a game I didn't understand. And then there were the moments with Vela, those fleeting, unexpected exchanges that seemed to carry more weight than anything else. Like the quiet evenings when she would sit in the palace garden, her gaze distant, lost in her thoughts. Sometimes she would invite me to sit with her, though we wouldn't speak much. The silence was comfortable, more so than I had anticipated. And in those moments, we found a semblance of peace. I could feel her watching me, studying me in those silent exchanges. I wondered what she saw when she looked at me. I was a human, a species she had no interest in, a species she had been forced to marry. But maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see more than that. She hadn't pushed me away, even when I had expected her to. She hadn't thrown me out of her life completely, even though that would have been the easiest thing to do. There were still no grand gestures, no declarations of affection, but there was something deeper forming between us, something that went beyond the formalities, beyond the obligations. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was an understanding, a recognition that we were both here because of forces outside of our control, and somehow we were both struggling to find our place in this shared space. It wasn't until one night, much later, when I found myself in the library of the palace, poring over the old texts, that the truth hit me. I had come to Zifra with one mission: to solidify a treaty with the Zephyrian people, to further the interests of Earth. But now, I realized, the stakes were higher. I wasn't just a diplomat anymore. I wasn't just a pawn in some larger scheme. I was a husband, a reluctant participant in this strange alien marriage, and my actions, my words, my choices would shape not only my future, but Vela's as well. The weight of it settled over me like a heavy cloak. The future wasn't clear, but it was mine to navigate. Our marriage was not a solution. It was a challenge, a puzzle with pieces I hadn't even begun to understand. But I had made a decision that night as I sat in that quiet, dimly lit library. I wasn't going to sit back and let life continue happening to me. I was going to choose a path forward, one that didn't just involve surviving the marriage with Vela, but actually living through it, learning, adapting, and maybe, just maybe, building something more out of the wreckage. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if Vela would ever come to see me as more than a formality, a relic of a political decision. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to give up on finding meaning in this, on forging some kind of connection with her. I wasn't going to let the forces that had brought us together completely dictate the story of our lives. And as I walked back through the silent halls of the palace that night, the realization hit me hard. This was my life now, this marriage, this strange, improbable bond. But maybe that wasn't the end of it. Maybe it was just the beginning of something unexpected, something I never would have chosen for myself, but maybe, just maybe, something worth fighting for.